18 years old, taking on 70 acres by yourself? The old farmer said, shaking his head. Son, I don't believe I've ever seen that happen. Elijah didn't argue. He just nodded, got in his truck, and drove back to the rusted iron gate waiting for him at home. 70 acres nobody else in Lancaster County wanted, bought with every dollar he had left after burying his mother that winter. He was 18. He was alone. And nobody believed he'd last 6 months. So what happened when, exactly 1 year later, that same farmer stood in a crowded room and clapped for him? Nobody in Willow Creek saw it coming, not even close. To understand how he pulled it off, you have to go back to where he came from. In the small town of Willow Creek, tucked into the farmland of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, everybody knew everybody. And everybody knew Elijah Carter as the quiet kid who showed up at Walter Higgins's farm every Saturday morning before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. He was the only black face among the old farming families who had worked that stretch of Pennsylvania soil for generations. And for years, that fact meant almost nothing to him. He was too busy learning. His mother, Denise Carter, raised him alone, working long shifts as a nurse at a small clinic on the edge of town. She never had time to teach him about land or livestock, and she never pretended to. What she gave him instead was a sense that hard work had a purpose, even when nobody was watching. It was Walter, the elderly farmer who lived 2 properties down, who taught him everything else. Elijah was 12 years old the first time Walter knelt beside him in a furrow of dark soil and pressed a handful of dirt into his palm. "Squeeze it," Walter said. "If it holds together but breaks apart easy when you poke it, that's good ground. If it turns to dust or stays in a hard ball, you've got work to do." Elijah squeezed. The soil held its shape, then crumbled at the touch of his thumb, and Walter nodded like he had passed some kind of test that mattered more than anything he was learning in school that year. That morning became the first of hundreds. Walter never had children of his own, and somewhere along the way, without either of them saying it out loud, Elijah became the closest thing to it. Over the next 6 years, Elijah learned to do more than just judge soil. Walter taught him how to read a sky before rain came in, how to tell a healthy hen from a sick one by the way she carried herself across a pen, how to patch a fence line so it would hold through a hard winter. None of it felt like work to Elijah. Even on the mornings his friends were still asleep and he was already elbow deep in a water trough. He never once thought of those Saturdays as preparation for anything. They were simply the hours of the week he looked forward to most. Denise noticed the change in her son long before she ever said anything about it. She worked shifts long enough that she was rarely home to see him leave for Walter's place, and rarer still to see him come back caked in dirt with a look on his face she recognized from her own younger years, a kind of quiet satisfaction that came from finishing something with your hands. She never discouraged it. She simply reminded him, more than once, that there was a difference between loving land and being able to survive off it, and that the second part required more than affection. There was another man in Elijah's life he barely remembered, his grandfather, Thomas Carter, a construction foreman who had died when Elijah was too young to hold on to more than a few scattered memories of him. What Thomas left behind was a savings account placed in trust for his grandson, untouchable until Elijah turned 18. Denise kept the paperwork in a drawer in the kitchen and told Elijah only that his grandfather had wanted him to have something to build a future with. Attached to the account was a short handwritten note, the kind of thing Elijah read so many times as a teenager that he could recite it without looking. It told him to use the money for something that actually mattered to him, not something that simply looked good on paper. For most of his childhood, that money sat in the background of Elijah's life, a distant promise attached to a birthday still years away. Then, during the fall of his senior year of high school, everything else in his life narrowed down to a single consuming worry. Denise had been feeling tired for months, the kind of tired she brushed off as double shifts and long hours on her feet. By October, the fatigue had turned into something else, something that sent her to the same clinic where she worked, this time as a patient instead of a nurse. The diagnosis came back serious. Elijah spent the rest of that school year splitting himself between algebra homework and hospital waiting rooms, Between college application deadlines that suddenly felt meaningless and the quiet, terrifying job of watching his mother grow weaker by the week. Walter kept showing up during those months, even though there was little farm work Elijah could spare time for anymore. He drove Denise to 2 of her appointments when Elijah's school schedule made it impossible, and he left bags of vegetables on the Carter porch every week without ever knocking or waiting to be thanked. Elijah never asked him to do any of it. Walter simply treated the situation the way he treated a struggling field, as something that needed steady, unglamorous attention rather than grand gestures. By early December, Denise could no longer manage the stairs in their house without help, and Elijah began sleeping on the couch outside her bedroom door so he could hear her if she called out in the night. He stopped filling out college applications altogether, though he never told her that. She held on through the first weeks of winter, but not by much longer. Denise passed away 2 weeks before Christmas. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday at a small church on the edge of Willow Creek, and half the town turned out, including Walter, who stood beside Elijah at the graveside with his hat pressed against his chest. Elijah did not cry during the service. He cried afterward, once the crowd had thinned, standing at the edge of the cemetery with Walter's hand resting on his shoulder. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," Elijah said. Walter looked out at the fields beyond the cemetery fence before he answered. "The land doesn't care how long you've been gone," he said. "It'll take you back whenever you're ready. People aren't always that patient. Land is." He meant it as comfort for a boy who had just lost his mother, nothing more. But the words stayed with Elijah in a way that Walter never intended, settling into some quiet corner of his mind and waiting there. Elijah turned 18 that January, 1 month after burying his mother. The trust his grandfather had set up finally released to him $78,000 that had been growing untouched for over a decade. Combined with the $14,000 he had saved himself over years of weekend work for Walter and 2 other farms nearby, Elijah found himself, for the first time in his life, in possession of $92,000 and no clear plan for any of it. His mother had always talked about community college, about him studying something steady, something with a future she could picture. His Aunt Carol, Denise's younger sister, made it her mission that winter to keep that plan alive. She drove up from Maryland twice that January alone, sitting at the kitchen table Elijah now had all to himself, going over enrollment deadlines and financial aid forms like the conversation could still be won on paperwork. "Your mother wanted you in a classroom come fall," Carol told him one evening. "Not out chasing something you don't have the first idea how to do." "I know what she wanted," Elijah said. "I also know what she gave me. Grandpa didn't put that money aside for community college tuition. He put it aside for something that mattered." "And you think 70 acres of dead land is what mattered?" Elijah did not have a fully formed answer for her that night. He had found the listing almost by accident 2 weeks earlier, scrolling through local land postings out of restlessness more than intention. 70 acres on the far edge of the county, abandoned for over a decade after its previous owner, an elderly farmer, had been forced off the land by his own failing health. The photograph showed a collapsing greenhouse, a rusted tractor sitting in a barn, fields gone wild with grass. Most people would have scrolled past it. Elijah could not stop looking at it. He drove out to see the property in person the following week, alone, and stood at the gate for nearly 20 minutes before he ever set foot on the land. Something about the stillness of it, the sheer scale of what it had once been and what it had become, reminded him of standing at his mother's graveside, listening to Walter talk about land that waits. He walked the property for 2 hours that afternoon, past the collapsed fencing and the greenhouse with its cracked panels, and by the time he reached his truck again, he already knew he was going to make an offer. Carol found out before he had the chance to tell her himself, through a cousin who had heard it secondhand at church. She called him that same night, her voice tight in a way he had never heard from her before. "You're 18 years old, Elijah. You buried your mother 2 months ago, and now you want to hand over everything your grandfather left you for a piece of land nobody has farmed in 10 years? "It's not nobody's land anymore," Elijah said. "It's going to be mine." That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now. The conversation ended without either of them backing down, and it was far from the last one they had that winter. Carol drove up twice more before the sale closed, each visit ending the same way, with her packing up her folders of community college brochures and Elijah walking her to her car without either of them raising their voice again. By the end of February, against his aunt's continued objections, and without a single member of his family standing beside him, Elijah signed the papers. The bulk of his $92,000 went toward the purchase price and the closing costs that came with it, leaving him only a slim cushion to survive the first hard months and buy whatever the land still needed. Carol did not come to see the property. Walter offered to drive out with him the day the deal closed, but Elijah asked to go alone. He remembered that morning clearly for the rest of his life. The raw February cold biting through his jacket, the rusted iron gate hanging slightly open on one hinge, the frost still clinging to the tall, dead grass on the other side of it. Nobody was there to see him walk through it. That was exactly how he wanted it. Whatever came next, he intended to build it with his own two hands, on his own terms, starting from a piece of land that everyone else in Willow Creek had already given up on. The house had not been lived in for more than a decade, and it showed. Mice had gotten into the walls. The pipes groaned when Elijah finally worked up the nerve to turn the water main back on, and the kitchen smelled like dust and old wood smoke. He spent his first night on the property wrapped in a blanket on the living room floor because the bedroom upstairs still had a section of ceiling missing, listening to the house settle around him and wondering, for the first time since signing the papers, whether Carol had been right about all of it. The barn was worse in some ways and better in others. The tractor Harold Grath had left behind sat exactly where the listing photos had shown it. Tires flat, a thick coat of dust over the seat, but the engine turned over on the third try once Elijah cleaned out the fuel line, and something about that small victory carried him through his first cold week on the property more than anything else could have. He drove that tractor in slow circles around the yard the following morning just to hear it run, laughing out loud at himself for doing it, with no one around to see him. He spent those first days walking the fields with a notebook, the same kind of notebook Walter had once used to track rainfall and planting dates, writing down everything that needed fixing in order of what would kill him fastest if he ignored it. The greenhouse came first, its cracked panels letting in more weather than they kept out. Then the chicken coops collapsed in on themselves along one wall. Then the fencing rotted through in a dozen places along the southern pasture. He did not have the money to hire anyone to help with any of it, so he did not try. He worked from first light until his hands stopped answering him properly, ate whatever came fastest out of a can, slept, and did it again. By the first week of March, the greenhouse panels were patched well enough to hold heat, and Elijah decided it was time to stop preparing and start committing. Before he did, he drove over to Walter's place one evening with his notebook, laying out what he was thinking of buying and how many of each animal the fields could reasonably support. "You're not wrong on the numbers," Walter told him, tracing a finger down the page. "Just don't buy more than you can walk to twice a day without killing yourself. A tired farmer makes mistakes, a rested one wouldn't." Elijah took that advice seriously enough to cut his planned flock size nearly in half before he ever set foot in the auction barn. He drove out to the livestock auction in Chester County that Saturday with what remained of his savings folded into an envelope in his jacket pocket. A little over $6,000, all that was left after the land and the first round of repairs. The auction barn was loud and full of men who had been buying and selling animals there longer than Elijah had been alive, the air thick with the smell of hay dust and diesel, and the constant rattle of the auctioneer's voice running numbers together faster than most newcomers could follow. Elijah kept to himself near the back rail, watching 2 full rounds of bidding before he raised his hand for the first time. And when he did, more than one head in the crowd turned to see who the voice belonged to. The laying hens went for a little over $4 a head. The Berkshire pigs ran closer to $110 each, more than he had budgeted for, but he had done the math on egg and pork sales enough times that week to know the number still worked if the animals were healthy. The dairy goats cost him almost nothing, since nobody else in the room seemed interested in bidding against a teenager for livestock that size. He left that day with 45 laying hens crated in the back of his truck, arrangements made for the 8 Berkshire pigs to be delivered later that week, and 2 dairy goats standing awkwardly in a makeshift pen he'd built into his truck bed, watching him with an expression he would later describe as pure suspicion. Between the animals themselves and the feed, mineral supplements, and delivery fee he paid before leaving the lot, he walked out with barely $200 left of the $6,000 he'd driven in with. A younger woman working the checkout table, maybe not much older than Elijah himself, slid his receipt across the counter with a small, genuine smile. "First time out here?" she asked. "That obvious? You bid like someone still doing math in his head. Everybody does it first." It was the kindest thing anyone at that auction said to him all day, and he held on to it on the drive back the same way he would end up holding on to the harder things people said as well. An older farmer named Gene Whitfield, who had sold cattle at that same auction for over 30 years, caught Elijah loading the last of the crates and shook his head slowly. 18 years old, taking on 70 acres by yourself, Gene said. "I've been coming to this auction a long time, son, and I don't believe I've ever seen that happen." "Guess I'll be the first then," Elijah said. Gene did not answer right away, just looked at him the way people look at something they expect to be proven right about eventually, then walked off toward his own truck without another word. Elijah thought about that look the whole drive home, and it settled into the same part of him where Walter's words from the funeral still lived, another thing he would carry whether he wanted to or not. The animals gave him something the empty fields hadn't, a reason to be up before dawn that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with purpose. But the work exposed problems faster than he could solve them. Setting up water lines for the new pasture rotation, Elijah discovered that nearly half the irrigation piping buried under the southern fields had cracked or collapsed entirely, likely years before Harold Grath had ever given up the property. He drove into town and got a quote from the hardware store on Main Street for enough PVC piping and fittings to replace the outdoor lines properly, and the number the clerk wrote on the receipt made him fold it up and put it in his glove box without saying anything. The 8 Berkshire pigs arrived by trailer 3 days after the auction, delivered by a hauler who backed up to the barn, dropped the ramp, and left before Elijah had finished signing the paperwork. The pigs bolted straight for the mud along the fence line the moment their hooves hit ground, and Elijah stood there in his boots laughing for the first time since before his mother's funeral, watching 8 animals that cost more than he wanted to think about immediately decide they were exactly where they belonged. He had just enough money and just enough time to patch the lines feeding the greenhouse, where his most immediate income depended on healthy soil. The outdoor lines running to the far pasture, the ones that would matter most in the dry heart of summer, he left for later, telling himself he would find the money for that repair once the farm started paying for itself. It was a decision made out of necessity, not carelessness, and he did not think about it again for months. March moved into April in a blur of repetitive, unglamorous labor. Elijah rotated the pigs across the worst sections of the southern pasture the way Walter had taught him years earlier, letting them root through the compacted earth and turn it before he followed behind with cover crop seed. He planted the greenhouse full of kale, spinach, and mixed greens hardy enough to survive the last of the cold. He mucked out the chicken coops twice a week and rebuilt the nesting boxes by hand, one board at a time, in the evenings when his body had nothing left to give the field. The 2 dairy goats came into milk by the middle of April, and Elijah taught himself to milk them from a library book he'd checked out the week he bought them, spilling more than he managed to save into the pail for the first several mornings before his hands finally learned the rhythm of it. He started selling small batches of goat cheese alongside the greens once he'd worked out a process that didn't waste half the milk. One more small stream of income layered on top of everything else he was trying to hold together at once. A typical day started before 5 in the morning with the goats calling from the barn, followed by 2 hours of feeding and watering before the sun was fully up. Then whatever the notebook said needed doing that week. Then the greenhouse. Then the pigs' fence line had to be moved before dark, so they didn't wander onto ground he wasn't ready for them to touch yet. He lost one hen to a fox in late March, found the loose section of coop wire the following morning, and spent an entire afternoon reinforcing every inch of fencing on the property rather than risk losing another. Mistakes cost him time he didn't have, and he learned that lesson early enough that it never happened twice. There were nights that spring when the size of what he'd taken on caught up with him all at once. Usually after the animals were fed and the house had gone quiet, and there was nothing left to distract him from the fact that he was 18 years old, entirely alone, and responsible for 70 acres that could just as easily swallow him as reward him. He never called Carol on those nights. He called Walter instead, sometimes just to ask a technical question about soil pH or feed ratios that he already half knew the answer to, mostly just to hear another voice confirm that what he was doing made sense to somebody besides himself. Walter came by more often than he let on he was worried, usually under the excuse of dropping off a tool Elijah had asked to borrow or checking on a fence line. In mid-April, he walked the southern pasture with Elijah for the first time since the sale had closed, kneeling in the same dark soil he had once taught a 12-year-old boy to judge with his bare hands. He dug his fingers into the ground, rubbed the dirt between them, and did not look satisfied. "This ground's been dead too long, Elijah," Walter said. "Pig rotation and cover crop is the right idea, but it's slow work. You're looking at 2 years before this section gives you anything worth selling, maybe longer." "I've been following exactly what you taught me," Elijah said. "Rotational grazing, compost, cover cropping. That's your method, Walter, not something I made up." "The method's right. The land's the problem. Some ground takes longer to come back than a man wants it to, no matter how well he treats it." "So what am I supposed to do? Wait 2 years and hope I've got enough money left to still be standing here?" "I don't know, son. I've farmed my whole life, and I've never seen anybody try to bring back a piece of ground this far gone in one season. I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because somebody ought to." Walter did not have anything else to add to that. He stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked out over the pasture for a long moment before he spoke again. "I'm not telling you to quit. I'm telling you not to be surprised when this piece of ground doesn't hand you anything for a while yet." It was the first real disagreement they had ever had, and it stung in a way Gene Whitfield's doubt at the auction never could have. Gene was a stranger. Walter had knelt beside him in the dirt when Elijah was 12 years old and taught him everything he knew. If Walter did not believe the southern pasture could be saved on Elijah's timeline, some quiet part of Elijah wondered if he was wrong about all of it. He did not say any of that out loud. He watched Walter's truck pull out of the drive and sat down right there in the dirt for a while, running the numbers in his head the way he used to run inventory numbers in his imagination, back when this was all still a stranger's abandoned property and not his own name on a deed. 2 years was a long time to hold his breath. He decided, sitting there, that he would rather find out for himself than take anyone else's word for how long the land needed, even Walter's. The house behind him had a working roof now, the barn no longer smelled of decay, and somewhere in the distance a hen called out from the coop he'd rebuilt board by board through the coldest weeks of March. He went back to work that same afternoon, because work was the only argument he knew how to make. May answered some of his doubts, even if it didn't answer all of them. The first greens from the greenhouse came in strong, and Elijah loaded crates into his truck before sunrise on a Saturday and drove to the farmer's market in Lancaster City, setting up a folding table with a hand-painted sign that simply read, "Carter Family Farm." He had never worked a market stall before and spent the first hour second-guessing his prices, but the greens sold themselves. Customers kept remarking on the color, the size of the leaves, the fact that a stand this good had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. An older woman named Patricia Duncan, who had been shopping that same market for 15 years, bought 2 bags of spinach and asked him where his farm was. "Out past the old Grath place," Elijah said. "That is the old Grath place," she said, looking at him a little differently after that. Nobody's grown a thing out there since Harold got sick. He sold out completely before 10 in the morning. He did the same thing the following Saturday and sold out again, faster this time, word having spread among the regulars about the new stand with the unusually rich, dark greens. By June, 2 restaurants in town had reached out directly. A chef named Nathan Cole, who ran a small farm-to-table place on Main Street, drove out to the property himself to see the operation before agreeing to a standing weekly order. "Most people selling me greens this good have been at it for 20 years, Nathan said, looking out at the greenhouse rows. "You've been doing this since February." "Land doesn't know the difference," Elijah said. "Either the dirt's right or it isn't." Nathan laughed at that, shook his hand, and left with a case of spinach in the back of his car. A second restaurant, a diner on the edge of town, called the following week after one of its regulars mentioned the eggs from the market stand. The owner, a woman named Rita Sandoval, who had run the place for over 2 decades, drove out herself before agreeing to anything, walking the coop line with her arms crossed and asking more questions about feed and pasture rotation than Elijah expected from someone running a diner. "I don't put my name behind anything I haven't seen for myself," Rita told him. "Too many places claim farm fresh and mean a warehouse 2 states over." "Come back anytime you want to check," Elijah said. "Nothing here's going to look different than it does today." She placed her first order before she left the property, and by the end of June, Elijah was filling 2 standing weekly orders on top of everything he sold Saturday mornings. July brought the kind of growth Elijah hadn't planned for so soon. The flock had grown past 150 birds through hatching and a second smaller purchase, and the eggs, rich and gold-yolked, developed a reputation of their own at the market faster than the greens had. One morning, half asleep, Elijah propped his phone against a fence post and filmed himself collecting eggs as the sun came up over the coop, uploading it without much thought before heading in to eat breakfast. By that evening, a regional farming page had shared it, and by the end of the week, it had been passed around several thousand times, mostly by people who had never heard of Willow Creek and never would again, but who left comments about the boy running a whole farm on his own. A few of those comments found their way to him secondhand, through customers at the market who mentioned they'd seen him online before they ever saw his face in person. He didn't know quite what to do with that kind of attention, so he mostly ignored it and kept working. One Saturday in late July, he spotted Gene Whitfield standing at the edge of the market crowd, hands in his pockets, watching the line at Elijah's stand from a distance without ever stepping up to it. Gene didn't buy anything that morning, and he didn't say a word to Elijah either. He just watched for a while, then got in his truck and drove off, and Elijah decided not to read too much into it either way. None of it showed up in his bank account the way it might have looked from the outside. Every dollar the farm brought in went straight back into feed, seed, and the dozen small repairs that never stopped needing attention. Elijah kept almost nothing in reserve, telling himself each month that the next one would be the one where he finally built a cushion. He did not have a plan for what would happen if something went seriously wrong before that cushion existed. He simply hadn't let himself consider it. Carol called him for the first time since the sale closed the week after the egg video made its rounds online, someone from her church having sent it to her without knowing whose farm it was. She didn't apologize for anything she'd said back in January, and Elijah didn't expect her to. But she asked more questions about the animals and the market stand in that one phone call than she had in the entire winter combined. It wasn't peace between them. It was something smaller than that, but it was something. The southern pasture, meanwhile, kept surprising him in small ways that made Walter's warning feel less like a wall and more like a timeline he might beat. The cover crop came in thicker than expected. The soil, when he worked it between his fingers the way Walter had taught him, held together better than it had in April, breaking apart clean instead of clumping into the hard, lifeless ball it used to form. He planted a modest run of winter squash there in mid-July, more as a test than a real commercial bet, choosing the southern field specifically because if anything was going to prove Walter wrong, he wanted it to be that ground. He did not tell Walter he had planted it. Some part of him wanted to be able to walk him out there in September and simply show him, rather than argue about it in advance. By the end of July, Elijah stood on ground that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd seen the property back in February. The greenhouse ran at full capacity. The flock covered most of the yard in the mornings. The pigs had turned nearly a third of the southern pasture from something Walter called dead into something that at least looked like it was trying. None of it had come easily, and none of it had come with any guarantee attached. Every gain still sat balanced on top of a bank account that could be wiped out by a single bad month. And Elijah knew it, even if the people buying his eggs and greens on Saturday mornings had no reason to. The first 2 weeks of August brought a dry spell that even longtime residents of Willow Creek described as unusual for the season, the kind of stretch old farmers talked about in terms of years rather than months. No meaningful rain fell for over 2 weeks straight, and the temperature held stubbornly high day after day. Elijah watched the greenhouse crops hold on well enough under the patched irrigation lines he had repaired back in March. The southern pasture was a different story entirely. The outdoor lines he had left unrepaired all spring, the ones he had promised himself he would get to once the farm built up a cushion, simply weren't there when he needed them most. He called the hardware store on Main Street the first morning he noticed the squash leaves starting to curl, hoping the price might have changed since March. It hadn't. He checked his bank balance sitting in the truck outside the store and understood, looking at the number, that fixing the outdoor lines properly before the crop failed simply wasn't going to happen. He hauled a garden hose out to the squash rows the first few mornings, dragging it the length of the field by hand, then borrowed a plastic water tank from Walter's place and filled it from the house spigot each evening, driving it out on the back of the tractor to hand water the worst rows before the worst of the day's heat set in. One night, well past midnight, he found himself still out there under the tractor headlights, moving down the rows with a bucket in each hand because the tank had run dry an hour earlier and he refused to stop until every plant had gotten something. His arms gave out before his will did. He sat down in the dirt between 2 rows of wilting squash and stayed there long enough to watch the sky start turning gray at the edges before he made himself get up and go feed the chickens. It bought him a few days, not more. A hose and a borrowed tank could never cover that much ground fast enough to matter against sun that showed no sign of breaking. The plants that had been thriving in mid-July began curling at the edges by the second week of August, the same wilting, defeated look Walter had warned him about back in April, except now it was happening on a crop Elijah had planted specifically to prove that warning wrong. Walter drove out twice that week, said less than usual, and helped haul water without being asked. He did not say, "I told you so," and Elijah found that harder to sit with than if he had. On the second evening, standing at the edge of the field with empty buckets at their feet, Walter finally spoke. "This isn't about the 2 years I told you about in April," he said. "This is just bad luck with weather, plain and simple. Different problem." "Feels like the same problem from where I'm standing," Elijah said. "Maybe. Or maybe you're closer to proving me wrong than either of us thought, and the weather just picked a bad time to test you on it." Elijah did not have anything to say back to that. He thought, standing there, about the note his grandfather had left with the trust money, the one that told him to spend it on something that actually mattered. He thought about his mother sitting at their kitchen table years earlier, telling him there was a difference between loving land and being able to survive off it. Both of them felt closer to him in that field than they had in months, as if the drought had stripped away everything except the parts of himself he'd built out of the two of them. He stood at the edge of that field one evening as the heat finally started to break, looking at rows of squash plants that represented more than a harvest. They represented the argument he'd made to Walter in April, the argument he'd made to Jean Whitfield without saying a word back in March, the argument he'd made to his Aunt Carol back in January when he told her this land was worth everything his grandfather had left him. If the southern pasture failed now, after everything, it would not just be a bad season. It would be proof that everyone who doubted him had been right, and Elijah did not have the money, the time, or a working irrigation system to stop it from happening. The forecast that night called for another full week without rain, and for the first time since he'd walked through that rusted gate in February, Elijah went to bed without any idea of what he was going to do in the morning. The dry spell did not break the way Elijah kept telling himself it would. A third week passed without rain, and the bucket runs that had carried him through the first 2 weeks stopped being enough. He walked the southern field on the morning of the 20th straight day without measurable rainfall, and counted more than a dozen squash plants that would not recover no matter how much water reached them now, their leaves gone brittle and pale at the edges, curling in on themselves like something folding closed for good. The rest of the field hung somewhere in between, not dead yet, not thriving either, waiting on him to decide what happened next. He sat with that thought for the better part of an afternoon, sitting on the tailgate of his truck at the edge of the field, turning the decision over the way Walter had taught him to turn soil, testing whether it held together or fell apart under pressure. Walking away from the southern field would free up every hour he was currently spending on buckets and hoses, hours he could pour back into the greenhouse and the animals that were still generating income no matter what happened to the squash. It was the responsible choice, the kind of choice a person running a business instead of chasing a point would make. It fell apart the longer he looked at it. Walking away from that field would not just cost him a season's worth of squash. It would mean admitting to himself, if to no one else, that everyone who had doubted him back in February had been right to, and that the ground Walter had called dead really had been dead all along. He was not ready to admit that, not with the greenhouse still thriving and the flock still growing, and everything else he'd built still standing on the strength of exactly the stubbornness everyone kept warning him about. Nathan Cole called that same week, not about the squash, just checking in after noticing Elijah looked worn down the last time he'd dropped off an order. Elijah told him the truth, that the dry spell had put the southern field in real danger, and Nathan didn't offer advice or sympathy so much as a simple, practical question. "Whatever you decide to do about it, does it change what you're bringing me Thursday?" Nathan asked. "No. Greenhouse and coop are both fine. It's just the one field." "Then handle the one field. The rest of us aren't going anywhere." It wasn't much, but it was one more small reminder that the farm had become something bigger than just Elijah standing alone against a piece of stubborn ground, whether he'd meant for that to happen or not. What he was not able to do any longer was fix the problem by himself. He drove over to Walter's place that evening, later than he usually allowed himself to visit, and found him on the porch finishing dinner. "I need to borrow some money," Elijah said before he could talk himself out of it. "Enough for a pump and proper line out to the southern field. I'll pay you back out of the fall harvest, whatever it takes." Walter set his fork down and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. "You drove all the way over here to ask me that like I might say no," Walter said. "I didn't want to ask anybody anything. I've been trying to do this whole thing without needing help from a single soul ever since my mother passed. Figured if I could do that much on my own, it would count for something." It already counted for something, long before tonight. Asking for help when you actually need it isn't the opposite of that, Elijah. It's part of it. Every farmer standing on land that's still producing after 30, 40 years has had somebody hand them what they needed at the right moment. Doesn't make the work any less theirs. Elijah did not have an answer ready for that, and for once he did not try to force one. Walter stood, already reaching for his truck keys off the hook by the door, and did not wait for a response before he kept talking. "We'll go to the hardware store first thing tomorrow. Bring your notebook. We're going to do this right instead of patched together with a garden hose." They spent the next 2 days running a proper line from the old farm pond down to the southern field, digging trench by hand where the ground was too rocky for the trencher Walter borrowed from a neighbor, laying pipe under a sun that hadn't let up in nearly 3 weeks. Walter paid for the pump and fittings himself at the register, waved off Elijah's attempt to hand him cash on the spot, and told him the fall harvest would settle it just fine. Walter worked alongside him instead of just visiting to check on him, the two of them barely speaking beyond what the work required, and somehow saying more to each other than they had in the tense conversation back in April. By the second afternoon, Elijah's hands were raw from the shovel, and his shoulders ached in a way even a year of farm work hadn't fully prepared him for. but the line ran true from the pond all the way to the last row of squash, and when they finally tested it, water reached the far end of the field within seconds. By the time they finished that evening, rain clouds had finally started building over the ridge to the west, the first real sign of a break in the weather since the dry spell began. The rain came 2 nights later, soaking the southern field along with the rest of the property, and the pump line held steady through the final dry stretch before it. What had looked like a lost crop in the second week of August turned into something worth harvesting by the middle of September. Before he cut a single squash, Elijah drove a soil sample from the southern field into the county extension office himself, the same office that had once told him what to expect from that ground, and asked them to run the same organic matter test they'd have run on any working farm. The results came back the following week, showing levels of organic matter that had climbed steadily since spring, healthy enough that the woman at the extension desk asked him twice whether he was certain about which field the sample had come from. Elijah walked the rows the morning he decided the squash was ready, kneeling down and squeezing the soil between his fingers the way he had 100 times that year, and it broke apart clean in his palm. The same test Walter had taught him when he was 12 years old, except now the ground answered the way he'd always hoped it would. Walter came out for the harvest itself, kneeling in the same dirt he had once called dead, and stayed quiet long enough that Elijah started to wonder if something was wrong. "I've farmed longer than you've been alive," Walter finally said, "and I would have bet everything I own that this ground needed 2 more years. I don't know that I've ever been happier to be wrong about anything." "You weren't wrong about the ground," Elijah said. "You were wrong about how long it'd take somebody stubborn enough to keep showing up to it." Walter laughed at that, the first real laugh Elijah had heard out of him in months, and asked if he could bring some of his own worn-out pasture by sometime to see what Elijah would do with it. "You've been teaching me since I was 12 years old," Elijah said. "Feels strange you asking me anything." "Everybody's got something left to learn, no matter how long they've been at it. I taught you how to read ground. Looks like you went and figured out how to read it faster than I ever did." It was as close to an apology as Walter was ever going to offer, and it was more than enough. That evening, after Walter had gone home and the last of the harvested squash sat crated in the barn, Elijah drove into town and stopped at the small church cemetery on the edge of Willow Creek for the first time since the funeral. He stood at his mother's grave with dirt still under his fingernails and told her out loud about the southern field, about the pump line and the soil test, and everything the year had cost him and given back in equal measure. He didn't know if she could hear any of it. He said it anyway because some things needed saying regardless of who was there to listen. Word of the harvest moved through Willow Creek faster than Elijah expected. Gene Whitfield showed up at the market stand 2 Saturdays later, the first time he'd actually stepped up to the table instead of watching from a distance, and stood there for a moment, studying the crates of squash stacked next to the eggs before he said anything. "Heard you pulled a real crop out of that southern ground," Gene said. "The piece everybody said was finished." "Heard right," Elijah said. Gene bought 24 eggs that morning without much more comment beyond asking when the next batch would be ready. He came back the following week and the week after that, until buying eggs from Elijah became as routine for him as anything else about his Saturday mornings, and the two of them settled into an easy, wordless kind of respect that neither one bothered explaining out loud. Nathan Cole doubled his standing order once the squash came in, working it into a seasonal dish he put on his menu with Carter Family Farm printed right under the description. Rita Sandoval started stopping by the property every few weeks instead of only when placing a new order, usually leaving with more vegetables than she'd technically paid for and waving off Elijah's attempts to correct the total. A reporter from the Lancaster County Farm Journal called in October after hearing about the property from one of the restaurants Elijah supplied. She spent an entire afternoon walking the fields with him, asking about the greenhouse, the pigs, the soil test results from the extension office. Near the end of the visit, standing at the edge of the southern field, she asked him what he would tell anyone else thinking about doing something as unlikely as what he'd done. "Nobody made me do it," Elijah told her. I could have taken the safe road my mother wanted for me, and it would have been the smart thing to do on paper. I just didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what this piece of ground could have been if I'd tried. The article that ran a few weeks later carried a photograph of him standing among the squash rows, the headline asking how a piece of land written off for over a decade had come back to life in under a year. The same county extension office that had told him back in February, when he'd gone in to register the farm, that he'd be lucky to get anything worth selling out of that ground within 2 years, reached out that winter and asked if he would speak at their annual Farmland Preservation Conference. By the time February came back around, 1 full year after Elijah had first walked through that rusted iron gate, the property looked nothing like the listing photographs that had once shown a collapsing greenhouse and a rusted tractor buried under a decade of neglect. He kept just over 200 laying hens now, along with 14 pigs and 5 dairy goats, descended from the animals he'd bought at that first auction. The greenhouse ran at full production through every season, supplying 4 restaurants across 2 towns instead of 1. That fall, he had started a subscription program. Families across Willow Creek and the surrounding towns paying ahead of time for a regular share of eggs, greens, and pork. The very first family to sign up turned out to be the Duncans, Patricia's daughter and son-in-law, who told him at pickup one Saturday that Patricia had been talking about his stand at every family dinner since May. By winter, he had enough members signed up that he'd had to start keeping a waiting list. His first year of gross revenue came in just under $98,000, more money than he had ever imagined a piece of abandoned farmland could produce, let alone one he had bought with his grandfather's savings and a stubborn refusal to be told what was and wasn't possible. The kitchen no longer smelled like dust and old wood smoke. There hadn't been a mouse in the walls since spring, and the tractor that once needed 3 tries just to turn over ran every morning without complaint. Carol had started driving up more often than the occasional phone call, not because anything between them had been fully repaired, but because she had stopped needing to be convinced the farm was real. She showed up unannounced one Saturday in January, stood at the edge of the market stand watching him work through a line of customers, and waited until the crowd thinned before she said anything. "Your mother would have hated the risk of all this," Carol told him. She also would have been standing right here every single Saturday, telling anyone who'd listen that her son ran the whole thing himself. "You don't have to pretend you weren't right to worry," Elijah said. "I'm not pretending anything. I was right to worry. I was wrong about what you needed to do about it." She looked around at the stand, the crates, the regulars greeting him by name. "I'd like to come to that conference if you'll have me there." He told her she didn't need to ask. He stood backstage for a few minutes before he was called up, running through the same kind of mental checklist he used to run through before an auction bid. Except this time there was no number to land on, just a room full of people waiting to hear how a piece of land nobody believed in had come back in under a year. Walter found him there, straightened the collar of his jacket without being asked, and told him the same thing he'd told him back in March about buying more animals than he could walk to twice a day. "Don't try to say more than you actually mean," Walter said. "The truth doesn't need dressing up. It just needs saying." Elijah stood at the podium at the county's Farmland Preservation Conference that February, in front of more than 200 farmers and extension agents, most of them decades older than he was, with Walter sitting in the second row and Carol sitting beside him. He told the room about the rusted gate, about the dry August that nearly cost him everything, about a man who had knelt beside him in the dirt when he was 12 years old and taught him to judge soil with his bare hands. Partway through, he noticed Gene Whitfield near the back of the room, arms crossed, listening the same careful way he'd listened at the auction the year before. Elijah closed with the same words that man at the graveside had once told him, words he had carried through every hard month since, without fully understanding why until now. "The land doesn't care how long you've been gone," he said. "It'll take you back, whenever you're ready. People aren't always that patient. Land is." The room rose to its feet before he'd even stepped away from the microphone, a couple hundred farmers and extension agents on their feet at once, And somewhere in the crowd, he could hear Walter's voice clearer than anyone else's. Even Jean was clapping, nodding once in Elijah's direction when their eyes met across the room, which was as close to a full retraction as Elijah figured he'd ever get. And he found he didn't need anything more than that. Afterward, Walter drove back out to Willow Creek with him instead of heading straight home, and the two of them walked the southern pasture together in the last light of the afternoon, boots sinking slightly into ground that had been nothing but dust and dead grass a year earlier. Elijah stopped where the squash rows had stood in September, now cleared and resting under a cover crop for the winter, and thought about the boy who had once knelt beside Walter in a furrow on a different piece of land entirely, learning for the first time what good ground was supposed to feel like in his own two hands. He thought, too, about the note his grandfather had left him, about using the money for something that actually mattered, and decided that whatever else came next on this land, he had at least answered that much already. The land stretched out green and steady in every direction now, waiting, the way land always had, for whoever was patient enough to come back to it. Beside him, Walter didn't say anything at all, and for once, neither of them needed to. Elijah's story was never really about the squash or the eggs or a piece of ground everybody else had already given up on. It was about what a person is capable of once they stop waiting for permission to try. He was 18 years old and grieving, and every reasonable voice around him said to play it safe. He didn't. But he also didn't do it completely alone, no matter how it might have looked from a distance. He asked Walter's advice before he ever raised his hand at that auction. He let Gene Whitfield's doubt sharpen him instead of stop him. And when the drought had him down to nothing, he swallowed his pride and knocked on a door because he'd finally learned that asking for help isn't the opposite of doing something yourself. It's part of it. That might be the truest thing in this whole story. The people who pull off the impossible are rarely the ones who insist on doing it completely alone. They're the ones who know exactly when to keep working and exactly when to ask. So if there's a piece of ground in your own life right now, whatever shape it takes, something you've been putting off because you don't feel old enough, ready enough, or qualified enough yet, maybe this is your reminder that it's more patient with you than you think. If this one stuck with you, we'd love to have you back. We tell a story like Elijah's every week. Real people who did the hard thing while nobody was watching. Follow along so you don't miss the next one. And if there's a moment in this story still sitting with you, tell us in the comments. We read every one. See you next week.